Welcome back to Bright Ideas from Acuity Brands on IndustrialSage. Today joining me is Eric Gibson, Director of Outdoor Product for Lithonia Lighting. Eric, you've been in the industry for more than 30 years. In your opinion, what is the most important consideration when someone is designing for outdoor lighting?
Well, the biggest challenge for outdoor lighting is obviously to produce sufficient light where you want it and minimizing the amount of light where you don't. Early on, that conversation was mostly about eliminating unwanted uplight. That's actually where the term cutoff came from. Back in 1932 was the first cutoff luminaire.
Wow.
It was a street light. And in 1972, I believe, is when the IES went through and introduced three terms that kind of helped describe cutoff. That was cutoff, semi-cutoff, and non-cutoff.
Okay, so those three sound very close to each other. Can you elaborate a little bit more?
Sure. The cutoff, if you'll imagine zero being straight down. Cutoff allows 2.5% of the light above 90 degrees and 10% of the light between 80 and 90 degrees. For semi-cutoff, it allows twice that, so about 5% of the light above 90 degrees and 20% between 80 and 90 degrees. And non-cutoff is kind of the catch-all for any luminaire that doesn't meet one of those other criteria.
Anything else? So I'm doing a little math here in my head, and so these terms were introduced in the 1970s, and you have about 30 some years of lighting experience.
Yes, I started when I was 2.
Yes, exactly.
So when I started work, the term that was used most common was full cutoff.
Okay.
And that was a result of a lot of pushback from the community about not wanting any uplighting at all. So what that meant was they eliminated the allowance for any uplight above 90 degrees. So that 2.5% is now gone for full cutoff. Otherwise, it is the same as cutoff. So it still allowed the 10% of the light between 90 and 80. Like I said, other than that, it's the same as cutoff.
So how are the outdoor luminaires configured today to meet these requirements?
Well, so uplighting is still a critical concern, right? 40, 50, 60 years later, it's still just as important as it was back then. But interestingly enough, those terms I just described have been retired by the IES. They retired them back in 2011.
Now that I understand what they
are,
I should
always
just forget
keep
that
you
now.
on your toes. So the new luminaire classification system is called the Luminaire Classification System, or LCS, and it concerns itself not only with uplight, but also with backlight and high-angle light. Now, the details are described in an Illumination Engineering Society technical memorandum. We don't need to get into the details, but in general, it's going to divide each luminaire into 10 zones. It's 4 in the front, 4 in the back, and 2 on the upper hemisphere.
Okay.
And all you do is you count the number of lumens that go into each one of those zones, and that will assign you a bug rating.
Okay, I've heard bug rating before. Can you explain a little bit more about that?
Sure. So bug stands for backlight, uplight, and glare. There are 4 backlight zones. So if you have a significant amount of lumens going into those 4 backlight zones, you will have a high B rating. There's 2 uplighting zones. So if you have a lot of light going into those 2 zones, you'll have a high U rating. And if you have a lot of light going into the forward or backward high angle zones, then you'll have a high G rating because G is equated with that high angle light.
Okay, and so is the goal to have as low a G rating as possible?
Yes, typically that is true. The goal of having a low G rating is a desirable thing to do. However, there are some trade-offs. The best way to get a low G rating is either to reduce the number of lumens going into those high angle zones. In other words, reduce your lumens for your luminaire, so drop the power of your luminaire.
Okay.
Or you can refocus it and take the light from those high angles and drop it down so it's a little bit more focused in a downward direction. Both of those will reduce your G rating.
Okay. So we talked about glare in a few other episodes, and I'm wondering if you're directing that light more focused and straight down, will that cause a glare issue?
Yeah, it's not so much a glare issue, but there are some negative consequences to any type of legislation like that. Essentially, if you go through and reduce the luminaire power, you will almost always end up having to reduce the pole height. As you reduce the pole height, they need to be moved closer together. So you're going to need more poles.
For the same space.
For the same space. The other thing is if you refocus the light and redirect the light downwards so you have a bright spot underneath the pole, you're cutting out the light that would have spread out more. So again, you still have to move the poles together. So you'll almost always end up with more luminaires and more poles. The advantage is at least each one of those luminaires would have less power associated with it.
And more energy efficient if you're using LED, as I have learned.
That's correct.
And then the U and the B ratings, are there any legislations enacted that put certification or requirements on those?
Yeah, there are. The B rating is almost typically limited to luminaires around the perimeter of a property. In those cases where an amount of backlight might actually cause light trespass onto an adjoining property. And the U is typically more of a blanket requirement where it'll just cover the entire city or municipality, where they'll say you cannot have anything greater than a U0 or something, or a U2.
Right.
And while restricting the uplighting is always a good idea, if that value gets too strict, and you say you're looking at a U0 in a community, almost by definition, that will exclude the use of any type of a historical or decorative post top. And a lot of city centers really kind of rely on that to keep a certain look and feel in their towns.
Yeah, it'll definitely change the aesthetic feeling of the area. And what are other than the aesthetic feeling or the aesthetic changes? What are some concerns around full cutoff or U0 requirements?
Well, so in a indoor environment, any type of uplight does a nice job of just bouncing off the ceiling, spreading out, reducing shadows, making it an overall more pleasant space.
Yes.
In an outdoor world, it doesn't work like that, right? Any uplight just basically goes off to the heavens, never to return. And it actually, if it were only that, it would be easy, but on its way out, it's going to intersect a number of different dust particles and water molecules, and that's actually going to scatter the light. That scattered light is basically sky glow. So you might have been driving through cross country in the middle of the night, and you'll see the glow on the horizon from a town before you can see any of the buildings. So that's that sky glow, which is essentially the manifestation of light pollution.
Okay, and I've definitely heard about light pollution. Sky glow is a new one. So is light pollution like smog or air pollution? Is it harmful to people?
Well, so not necessarily injured, but we share this planet with a lot of plants and animals. And regrettably, a lot of those plants and animals are negatively affected by any type of artificial light that we produce. It can affect their growth, their breeding, their migration. I mean, it has some very negative effects. From a person's perspective, it really is more about robbing them from their ability to enjoy the night sky. So for amateur astronomers, they can't see the sky in those cities. They quite often have to haul off into the dark rural areas outside of town in order to see the night sky. But even those giant telescopes that the scientists use, even those, they find it very challenging to see the details that they're looking through when you have that fog of light surrounding it.
So there's a lot of things to consider: uplight, full cutoff, the bug ratings. What is the ideal solution? How do you know what to choose for your application?
Well, so most every product produced today would fall into that cutoff or full cutoff category. That's by far the most common product available in the market today. And in addition, you had mentioned LEDs. We are almost exclusive LEDs now, and LEDs are very, very small. That allows us to provide very, very detailed optics around them. So even though we do have to cut off the backlight and reduce that high angle light, we are still able to produce a very well-refined and very effective optic.
Something very visually comfortable, I guess. And who is managing all of these requirements of these lighting fixtures and designs?
So there's several, right? We mentioned earlier the Illumination Engineering Society. They're the ones that created the technical memorandum that described the luminaire classification system. There's also the International Dark Skies Organization. They are basically, they produce a list of products that they feel preserves the night sky.
Okay.
So those two organizations have essentially tools that they enable to help measure and keep track of all these negative effects of light.
Right, they're not making the laws that say you have to do it.
Correct.
Okay.
And that's the interesting part. The actual legislation or the management of these requirements is done at the local municipality.
One size doesn't fit all, I'm assuming.
Right. So what happens is whatever the municipalities create is what the contractors and the designers have to end up working around. Now, some municipality folks are very, very wise to the ways of light and others aren't. So what we've done is the IES and the IDA, the Dark Skies Organization, about 9 years ago, they created a joint task force. And that joint task force was assigned to create a model lighting ordinance, which is an ordinance that any municipality that wanted to could just adopt as their own. And that's a great way of getting some of the obsolete terms like cutoff and full cutoff out of their existing legislation and bring it up to more modern standards. Now, regardless of who's managing it, the ultimate goal for anybody, the municipality, the engineers, the contractors, and ourselves, is really to, I mentioned it earlier, go back to assigning the maximum amount of light as possible in the areas that you want it, and really minimizing the amount of light where you don't. And truthfully, in simplest terms, that is the key for outdoor lighting.
Well, Eric, thank you so much for illuminating me on many details of outdoor lighting. Eric is going to join us again next week, where we will discuss the special considerations for coastal properties. Please tune in.